All right, everybody that has a handout, and I also sent this out on email for those that are tuned in with us. The title today is Israel and Egypt, What is to Come? In the Thursday In Accord that Mr. Clyde Kylo had just had aired, he says, we should be aware of the significance of the tensions going on in the Middle East. The world's future is hinging on that specific area. I quote him on that. And what has happened in the last 2 weeks, the past 2 weeks have seen a sudden rise in tensions in and around Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, the Palestinian territory. And so this brief Bible study is a focus on the rise of hostilities between the Palestinians and the Israelis and how the tensions fit into Bible prophecy. Now, we've been talking about this subject for many decades, and we're seeing, again, after 7 years of relative calm, just the last 2 weeks, a rise in these tensions. The title today, again, Israel and Egypt, What is to Come? Now, Mr. Clyde Kylo concluded his In Accord this past Thursday evening by saying that it would do well for us to stay abreast of these events happening in the Middle East as they relate to Jerusalem, which is going to be the focal point of end-time events. After all, that's where God's saints are going to be given a position of rule as spirit beings, and it'll be the future home of the glorified saints for 1,000 years, and who knows, beyond. Now, on World News this past Thursday, a Reuters article explained that Egyptian officials brokered a ceasefire agreement between Palestinians and the Israelis. The truce appeared to be part of a two-stage deal that Cairo, the capital of Egypt, negotiated, sending security delegations also to Tel Aviv and to the Palestinian territory to try to get these rockets from stopping. 3,400 plus rockets were launched from Gaza Strip into Israeli territory, into occupied areas, civilian areas. 3,400 plus rockets. As of yesterday, Friday morning, Palestinians and Israelis were dancing in the streets, both claiming that they had reached a success or a victory in this past 2 weeks of skirmishes. And yet, we know that both sides suffered damage. Reuters article says the violence that erupted on May 10th, by the way, that was 2 days before the end of the month of Ramadan. That's the fasting month for Muslims, a whole month of daytime fasting and nighttime feasting for adherents to Islam. And so this erupted. It was triggered by Israeli police raids in the East Jerusalem Al-Aqsa Mosque area, the compound, and clashes with Palestinians against Israeli police. And so that tensions rose from there. Now, yesterday, another Reuters news headline said, Israeli and Hamas ceasefire, but Jerusalem clashes break out again. These are clashes in the streets. These are clashes that we're even seeing in our cities, New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, groups of people attacking other groups between Jews and Arabs. And it's very sad to see this spilling over into other nations, this kind of tension, where it started over in the Middle East. So it's just a sign of the times we live in. The violence is growing in many nations, and hatred towards between one group of people, ethnic groups, and another. Hamas is the terrorist group that has been instigating this. They take responsibility for all those 3,400 rockets being shot into Israeli territory. And so Hamas terror group, they have also had these extensive tunnels they've been building for years. I read that 62 miles of those tunnels were destroyed by Israeli airstrikes as a retaliation for these rockets. And they have many supplies. They do training under these tunnels. They keep weapons under these tunnels. And so that was their retaliation for this. Now, we know that this is only going to increase. In fact, Hamas leaders vowed to rebuild and continue the hostilities A senior member of the Hamas political bureau, Izzat el-Rashik, said this, quote, "It is true the battle ends today, but Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel and the whole world should know that our hands are on the trigger, and we will continue to grow the capabilities of this resistance." We know this won't end. And prophecy points that out, doesn't it? So a great many prophecies in the Bible have yet to be fulfilled, and many of them centering around the Middle East. As Mr. Clyde Kylo mentioned in his In Accord, some 800 different references to Jerusalem are given in the Bible. And most prominently, we know and understand that Israel of the Bible includes the descendants of Judah. A lot of them had resettled after World War II into the area of Palestine in 1948 with the establishment of an Israeli state of Israel. Many more in the United States and Great Britain. And then, of course, you have the English-speaking nations. The modern-day Israel of the Bible includes the other tribes of Israel, predominantly Manasseh and Ephraim. Ephraim and Manasseh, the United States being the descendants of Manasseh predominantly, and then the British Commonwealth nations, South Africa, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the British Isles being the descendants of Ephraim. And so we know that these are the areas that will also be impacted in the years to come. The world is a lot more complex than it was in 1947. I'm going to ask a show of hands. Anyone take a random guess? I don't expect you to know the answer, but how many nations were identified by the United Nations in 1947? It was 2 years after the end of World War II. Just give me a wild guess, anybody. How many nations? 30? Okay, someone said 30. Anyone else? Somebody. Okay, Matthias, you're usually good for an answer. 72? That's an interesting answer. Well, okay, Mr. Lineback? All right, 10, 30, 72. It was actually only 45 nations, so we're in the ballpark. Now, the United Nations identifies 195 nations on Earth, as of yesterday anyway. These things for a few years were changing. Every 6 months, there would be new revised maps of the world. A number of years ago, every 6 months, you'd start seeing new revised maps. Anyway, why has the Middle East become such a focal point in modern history when just before World War II, Middle Eastern nations didn't influence the rest of the world very much? What was it? What was the key element in the Middle East that put them on the geopolitical map? Thank you very much. Mr. Metzner says oil. Absolutely. Black gold, Texas tea, you know. It was oil that put them on the map. I did some reading yesterday about the history of petroleum distillates from 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and how, you know, just amazing to see how the rise in Middle Eastern oil came to play a major part in the 50s and 60s and 70s and so forth. And so Arabs and Jews acknowledge that both the Bible and the Quran have a common heritage dating back to Abraham. The Quran has a number of references to Abraham and even Jesus Christ in it. And yet we have this conflict, and we have this conflict over in the Middle East where there are three of the world's great religions: Christianity, Islam, and what's the third one? Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. All three focused in that little area. And Israel, as a geographic area, is about the size of New Jersey. That's all. And so much is going to happen there in the next few years. So much has been happening there. Hostilities still simmer there since the conflict between Isaac's sons, Jacob and Esau. That's where the conflict began. We're going to read a passage here from Ezekiel in a moment on that. What happened? Well, Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of lentil soup. Genesis chapter 25. A little later, Jacob deceived his father Isaac into giving him the firstborn blessing of Esau by an oath that was permanent. It could not be taken back. It could not be revoked. That's in Genesis 27. And because of those actions by Jacob, Esau hated his brother Jacob. And this is fascinating because over 1,300 years later, the prophet Ezekiel spoke of the quote-unquote everlasting hatred between the descendants of Jacob, Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph, etc., and the descendants of Esau, Edom, Edomites, Arab countries. And so this would continue. Ezekiel 35, verse 5 in your notes. Ezekiel 35, verse 5 says, he says this through Ezekiel, God does, about the land of Edom he's speaking of here, the ancestors of many of today's Arab nations, of Edomites. He says, because you have had an ancient hatred, on the margin, it might say perpetual or everlasting. That's where I got the word here. An everlasting hatred. And have shed the blood of the children of Israel by the power of the sword at the time of their calamity, when their iniquity came to an end. Therefore, as I live, says the Lord God, I will prepare you for blood, and blood shall pursue you. Since you have not hated blood, therefore blood shall pursue you. In other words, they have had a bloodthirst for attacking Israel through history. Ancient times up to the present, Esau and Jacob clash. They do today in the Middle East. Back to the modern time we live in. Where is this perpetual conflict leading in the Middle East? Well, as prophecy points out, it will be even focused more narrowly on the Temple Mount in the coming years. We've had many dialogues, many discussions on whether a full structure of a temple needs to be established, or maybe just an offering, altar of offering, or some other type of platform where offerings can be made for a period of time before they're cut off again. But can you imagine the geopolitical and the security risks at this moment of the Jews trying to establish a place of offering anywhere around the compound where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is and the Dome of the Rock? Now, for just a little reference point, when you look at pictures of that beautiful gold dome in the platform where it is believed Solomon's temple was, that is called the Dome of the Rock. On the same compound, off to the side, you'll see a gray or dull silver dome. That's the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So both of those are holy places. Dome of the Rock has that big chunk of rock in the middle of the floor where it is thought by Muslims that Muhammad had jumped on his flying steed, his Pegasus horse, and flew off to heaven in it. That's what they believe. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is a place of worship, a mosque on the same compound. Anyway, those are very, very holy places to the Islamic community. How many Muslims are there in the world? I think 1.3 billion and growing. It's the fastest growing religion on the earth today, Islam. Anyway, let's get back to where we were. Jesus Christ warned, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by enemies, he says, then know that its desolation is near. That's from Luke 21, verse 20. That's another marker in time close to the end of the age. And the prophecies of the Bible predict that this conflict in the Middle East will escalate, and it will become the very center of war and violence up until Jesus Christ returns. Where does Egypt fit in now? Since that, I tried to narrow down today's Bible study. This was part of an hour-and-a-half Bible study. I said, well, I can't do that. I have to shrink it down to 35 or 40 minutes. So where does Egypt come in? Well, one thing we need to know before I tell you about end-time prophecy is geopolitical things can change dramatically and suddenly. Case in point, 2011. There was a local revolution in Egypt. It was mainly led by youth groups that were protesting brutality and inequities in the government. They had marches and demonstrations, occupied plazas. It was a nonviolent civil resistance, but there were also some violent resistance taking place. But then the eyes of the world began looking at Egypt again, and then it spread onto what was called the Arab Spring. Keep in mind, that was 2011. That was 10 years ago. And so from that point forward, Egypt started to even come into the worldview even more. You already mentioned oil is right at the heart of why the world would pay attention. It wasn't too many years back, I believe in the 1960s, that Egypt took over the Suez Canal, and they managed the traffic through there, and it caused a war to start. Who knows if that might happen again, but the Suez Canal is a 120-mile long stretch. It is owned by, it's called the Suez Canal Authority, but it's owned by Egypt. Egypt owns it and operates it. In 2020, last year, the total revenue generated by just allowing 18,829 passages of ships in 2020, carrying 39 million barrels of oil a day, as well as other goods. It generated $5.6 billion just last year. So you can see how this is not only a strategic waterway for the world, especially over in Europe, but also that Egypt makes a lot of money off of this, and they control it. So could you see how that's possibly a bottleneck, and it could cause another global conflict should Egypt do something crazy like try to block nations from using the Suez Canal. So I'm just saying that could happen. It has happened in the past. God is steering an alignment of what looks like Arabic nations. And of course, Middle Eastern oil is at the heart of it. Now, let's talk for a moment about alliances with Egypt. It's remarkable how often Israel, over its history, has looked to Egypt to make alliances, to find support against other enemies in times of difficulty, instead of inquiring of God. In ancient times, Israel looked to Egypt rather than God. It caused their iniquity, and that was an unfaithfulness to the covenant. God was never pleased with that, and God would punish Israel when they would do this. Sadly, modern-day Israel of the Bible hasn't learned this message either. We see that even today, the United States, the descendants of Manasseh, and Judah, the modern descendants of the Israel state, they put their confidence in Egypt. It says in your notes, Isaiah 30, verse 1, it's setting a stage here for more fulfillment of prophecy. Woe to the rebellious children, says the Lord Eternal, who take counsel, but not of me, and who devise plans, but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin. Verses 2 and 3, who walk to go down to Egypt, they have not asked my advice, to strengthen themselves in the strength of Pharaoh, and to trust in the shadow of Egypt. Therefore the strength of Pharaoh shall be your shame, and trust in the shadow of Egypt shall be your humiliation. Meaning it's not going to come to fruition. Egypt is not going to come to the aid of Israel, the descendants of Israel, modern day. And remember, I'm combining together the descendants of Judah, Ephraim, Manasseh, if not even more of the 12 tribes of Israel. Ancient Israel and Judah have had a history, a penchant to leaning on Egypt when God says, don't do it, don't do that. It would lead to disappointment and disaster. Verse 4, God continues through Isaiah, for his princes were at Zoan, and his ambassadors came to Hanes. Zoan was the residence of the kings of Lower Egypt, and it would be the place where the ambassadors would naturally resort to negotiate alliances. Hanes or Hanes, I'm not sure exactly how it's pronounced. It was a royal city in Egypt where, again, negotiating political alliances would take place. Verse 5, they were all ashamed of a people who could not benefit them or be of help or benefit, but a shame and also a reproach. What it's saying is when Israel's ambassadors would go down to Egypt, they either found them unwilling or unable to give them the alliance they needed, unable to render any aid, and they were so the Israelites were ashamed that they had sought the assistance of Egypt rather than going straight to God and looking for God's help. In recent times, the U.S. and modern state of Israel have poured much money into Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, to try to negotiate a longer peace with Israel in the region. And so pouring money into these, and the Palestinian Authority giving them money too, to uphold a peace treaty with the Israeli people. But it will eventually come to nothing. God would have taken care of this peace if Israel and Judah would seek God's counsel. So the point being, this carries over to modern day the same warning that God gave ancient Israel not to make alliances with Egypt. Verse 7, for the Egyptians shall help in vain and to no purpose. Therefore I have called her Rahab Hamshebeth. Barnes Notes commentary says Rahab Hamshebeth refers to literally a flying serpent, thought to be particularly fast and deadly snake. The noun Rahab indicates ferocity, haughtiness, boasting, insolence, and the name was doubtless given to Egypt on account of its insolence and pride. This brings us to duality in prophecy. We should always mention that many prophecies in the Bible have a dual fulfillment, dual meaning. Question for you. Is Egypt part of the end-time king of the south? Well, there's one passage, I'll show you, I'll give you the answer. Yes, it looks that way. It looks that way. Egypt appears to be part of the king of the south, yet to be revealed. Daniel 11 is the chapter that discusses this. It's all about the time of the end. The last part of Daniel 11, the prophecy leaps toward the time close to Christ's return. Daniel 11, verse 42. It shows that Egypt will be involved in this second fulfillment. There was a first fulfillment of the king of the north and king of the south. This will be the second one. This king of the south will attack the king of the north. We understand this to be the beast power, yet to be revealed in Europe. King of the south looks like it might be a confederation of Arab states, but Egypt is involved in this. And so the king of the north is the revival of the fourth great ruling kingdom, Holy Roman Empire, if you will, of Daniel chapters 7 and 2 and 7. This chapter speaks of the king of the south. And let's see, it says in Daniel 11, verse 40, let's read it together. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, the king of the north, and the king of the north shall come up against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. What this is showing is when the king of the south attacks the king of the north, north geographically would be north of Jerusalem. Wherever Jerusalem is, marks out what is north, south, east, and west in Bible prophecy. So we have some Middle Eastern nation or nations attacking to the north of them, which appears to be up in Europe. And so it's going to be an attack which will have a counterattack, very swift and much more aggressive counterattack. And it'll take the battle even further of encroaching into the glorious land. The glorious land would be Jerusalem in the Bible and the ancient borders of Israel. And then verses 42 and verse 43 goes on to say, the king of the north shall stretch out its hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So Egypt is somehow involved in this king of the south. Right here we can see that. In verse 43, he, the king of the north, shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and Ethiopians will follow at his heels. In other words, they will also come under submission to this overpowering force coming from the north. Now, is Egypt gilded with gold and silver and wonderful, nice things? It's a very poor country. It's very overpopulated, but it's that oil again. It's that oil that is part of this whole aspect of wealth of Egypt. Egypt again will once again become subjugated and occupied toward the end of the age. God speaks through Isaiah on this. Isaiah 19 verse 4 in your notes. And the Egyptians I will give into the hand of a cruel master, and a fierce king will rule over them, says the Lord of hosts. And so also the time of this prophecy is yet to be. Verses 5 and 6 gives us the timing. It says, when the waters of the Nile shall be wasted and dried up, and when the rivers shall turn foul, and the brooks of defense will be emptied and dried up. What does that allow? It allows armies to march right over dry land, doesn't it, when that happens? And it says when the waters of the Nile are dried up. This has not happened in Egypt's history. It's not something that can be found in Egypt's history in the past. The prophet Ezekiel speaks of this time. Ezekiel 30 verse 3 in your notes. For the day is near, even the day of the Lord is near. It will be a day of clouds. I looked that up in a commentary. When it says a day of clouds, it clearly means a day of disaster, a time of calamity. It's a time of the Gentiles. The sword shall come upon Egypt, and great anguish shall be in Ethiopia. When the slain fall in Egypt, and they take away her wealth, and her foundations are broken down. And so at or around the same time, Jerusalem also is a focal point. Remember the things that are going to happen in Jerusalem. There will be a time when armies surround it and occupy it. And then there will be a period of time when, I don't know if it's before or after, but it's when the allowance, somehow a negotiated peace and allowing Jews in Israel to reinstate animal sacrifices, and then it'll be taken away again. Some of those are earmarks, or they're markers for end-time events. Zechariah 14, verse 2. Now we talk for a moment about Jerusalem itself. Zechariah 14, verse 2. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, and your spoil will be divided in your midst, for I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. There will be a remnant left there to defend the city, a physical remnant of people. And of course, this invasion of Jerusalem takes place very close to Christ's return. It doesn't look that pretty when you look at what things are still up ahead for the Middle East. But Jesus Christ will return to stop conflict and bring a forced peace that human beings haven't been able to do for thousands of years. And we know that eventually any nation who tries to move Jerusalem will itself find itself in great difficulty trying to affect what's going on in Jerusalem. Zechariah 12, verse 2 in your notes. Behold, I will make Jerusalem a cup of drunkenness to all the surrounding peoples when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. And it shall happen in that day. Now, that word by itself, that phrase, in that day, at that time, at the time of the end, in those days, that all does point to the day of the Lord, the time of Christ and God's intervention in human affairs. It says, in that day that I will make Jerusalem a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces, though all the nations of the earth are gathered against it. Can you fathom in your mind all the nations of the earth gathered against that little tiny postage stamp size piece of geography the size of New Jersey in the United States. And God comes to its aid. God will defend Jerusalem in the end. It will be a heavy stone. There are many complexities surrounding the conflicts in the region that, again, date back thousands of years. Let's keep on going. Zechariah 12, verse 4. It takes Jerusalem right up to the day of God's wrath against the nations that are trying to attack Jerusalem. It says, "In that day, says the Lord, I will strike every horse with confusion and its rider with madness. I will open my eyes on the house of Judah. I will strike every horse of the peoples with blindness." Jerusalem is called the apple of God's eye. God has had an eye and a tenderness and a longing for Jerusalem since King David set it up as the home place for the tabernacle and eventually the temple. And God has said that his son will make his home in Jerusalem when he returns to this earth. Verses 5 and 6, "And the governors of Judah will say in their heart, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are my strength, and the Lord of hosts, their God. In that day I will make the governors of Judah..." Well, let me pause right there. What does that tell you, that first sentence? The inhabitants of Jerusalem are my strength, and the Lord of hosts, their God. It shows me that there's a heart-rending return to God, to ask God for intervention, to ask God for protection, to ask God to surround that city and stave off all these other armies that are going to destroy it, apparently. "In that day I will make all the governors of Judah, like a fire pan in the woodpile, like a fiery torch in the sheaves. They shall devour all the surrounding peoples on the right hand and on the left." That tells me God is going to give extra strength to the physical remnant living there in Jerusalem to fend off great armies. Now, Israel, since its founding in 1948 as a nation state, after thousands of years, they went through several wars, vastly outnumbered by other nations around them, including Egypt. And they overtook them, and they gained more land, and they were victorious. And the whole world stopped and looked with wonder at how Israel could do that. It's going to happen again, apparently. They're going to have the power that they need by God's intervention. And it says, "But Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place." Jerusalem. Then Israel is going to look at the very humble state of Egypt and never again be compelled to make alliances with Egypt. Zechariah 14, verse 3, we'll see finally God bringing peace. It says, "Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle." All the things that human beings have tried to do to broker peace in the Middle East have failed. Jesus Christ, when he comes back to the earth, will do it. He will bring peace to the region. And verse 9, "And the Lord shall be king over all the earth. In that day it shall be. The Lord is one, his name one." When Jesus Christ is revealed, he establishes his place on a throne in Jerusalem. He will start to rule the world from that location. Of course, God's saints are going to be right there helping and administering God's laws, and they will emanate across the world like the waters cover the oceans. Verse 9, "Of the Lord shall be king over all the earth." Okay, let's see, verses 18 and 19. "If the family of Egypt will not come together and enter in, they will have no rain." Now, this is where we read about how Egypt is used as an example of the Gentile nations who will be commanded to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. If they don't, they suffer for it. That doesn't go on probably for very long before starvation, famine takes place, and nations start to be humbled. And so God is using Egypt as an example here through the prophet Zechariah. Let's read again. "If the family of Egypt will not come up and enter in, they shall have no rain. They shall receive the plague from which the Lord strikes the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations who do not come up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles." Not just Egypt, all the nations who do not honor God and learn of his ways. And then the prophet Isaiah gives an interesting prophecy of God's mercy when they cry out for his help and his deliverance. Isaiah 19, verse 20, for they will cry to the Lord because of the oppressors, and he will send them a Savior and a mighty one. Who is that? Well, Jesus Christ, and he will deliver them. So we see that Egypt is earmarked for a number of reasons in prophecy, but the Gentile nations will also follow the same kind of pattern, and God will treat them the same way. When the Egyptians, like all of us today, heed God's warning and God's loving chastisements, then God will return with kindness and mercy. And Isaiah goes on to say in verse 22, and the Lord will strike Egypt, he will strike and heal it. They will return to the Lord, and he will be entreated by them, and God will heal them. All that's already mapped out. God already knows the proclivities of people this far in advance. And again, he uses Egypt as an example here. How many years could that take before they are fully eager to learn God's ways and teach their children and wipe away all the paganism for thousands of years? We only speculate. It could be a couple of generations. It could be longer. These things won't happen overnight. There will still be conflict, and there will be people that will resist Christ's rulership when he returns to the earth. We know that. That's a different prophecy, but there will come a time when God says they will return, and they will learn about Jesus Christ and his sacrifice for humanity, and they will long to keep the holy days and the Sabbaths. Through Isaiah, to finish here, it says God predicts a time when he will say, verse 25, and this is one of the amazing passages that shows the turnaround in the future. Blessed is Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance. Arch enemies for thousands of years, all cooperating, all learning in harmony, all learning to keep God's laws together. So that concludes this Bible study. Next month in June, I plan to bring you a part 2 of prophecy in the Middle East. And at this time, I'd like to ask Mr. Hervé Dubois to lead us in hymns and introduce the remainder of services.